And now, marine weather around Alaska.
Coastal water forecasts here for the south coast of the Panhandle. Southeast winds tomorrow, 25 knots. About the same up north here. Southeast 20 to 25 knots. Lynn Canal, southeast 20 with gusts 35. And then southeast 15 for Stevens Passage. Clarence Strait, southeast at 20 knots. For the day on Friday, gale warnings here for the central and south coast, with that front getting quite close to the area there for south to southeast winds 35 knots. And east to southeast winds 25 to 35 knots for the north coast. Clarence Strait, gale warnings also south at 35 knots with 10-foot seas. Small craft advisories for Stevens Passage, southeast at 25. And Lynn Canal, southeast winds 15 knots. Prince William Sound, south winds 20 knots tomorrow with 4-foot seas. Cook Inlet, southeast or southwest winds at 20 knots. Same thing for Kamishak Bay and the Barren Islands. Small craft advisories for the North Gulf Coast. Southwesterlies 25 to 30 knots. And for the day on Friday, Cook Inlet, north winds 15 to 25 knots. 30-knot northwest winds for the Kamishak Bay area and the Barren Islands, looking at gale force northwest winds at 35 knots. And Prince William Sound, east at 20, and east winds 30 knots for the eastern North Gulf Coast, and north at 30 knots for the western coast. And for Kodiak Island, south to southwest winds at 20 knots, south to southwest winds 15 to 20 knots for the Alaska Peninsula, and south at 15 for Bristol Bay. And then for Friday, northwest winds 25 knots here blowing across the peninsula, northwest at 20 for Bristol Bay, and also small craft advisories for Kodiak Island, northwest winds 25 to 30 knots. Eastern Aleutians tomorrow, small craft advisories and gales. Northwest winds 25 knots for Unalaska Island, becoming gales over toward Nikolsky. 35-knot winds also for Adak and Atka. And the Western Aleutians, all winds northwest at 25 to 30 knots. And then with the next stronger front pushing in, we've got good gale force winds coming into the Western Aleutians here for Friday out of the south and southeast, 40 to 45 knots. Winds also increasing to gale force for Adak and Atka, up to 35 to 40 knots there. And for the eastern Aleutians, west-southwesterlies at 30. And the southwest coast here, looking at, well, the Yukon Delta coast, St. Lawrence Island, north winds at 30 knots. Kuskokwim Delta coast south at 20 knots, northeast at 20 for Norton Sound. And gale warnings for the northern Bering Sea here around St. Matthew Island for north winds at 35 knots and the Pribilofs northwest 30. North at 30 for the Pribilofs on Friday with northeast at 40 knots now for St. Matthew Island. Brisk wind advisories, Yukon Delta coast, St. Lawrence Island, north at 25 down to 15 from the north for Norton Sound, and northwest at 20 there for the Kuskokwim Delta coast. And then for tomorrow, eastern Beaufort Sea coastline, gale warnings, east winds 30 to 45 knots, east at 20 knots there for the central coast, turning north at 20 on the western coast, and the Chukchi Sea, pretty good winds out of the north at 30 to 35 knots. And then for the day on Friday for the Chukchi Sea, brisk wind advisories, north to northwest 25 knots, kind of a northwest breeze at 15 for the western Arctic coast, central coast. That'll be the lightest wind area for east at 10. And then brisk wind advisories for the eastern Beaufort Sea coast for east winds at 25 to 30 knots.